My psycho cousin is threatening to hurt my family if we don't give him more money. So I'm setting him up and risking my life to put him in prison. My cousin Caleb smiled when he saw that I had come to the meeting alone. Then he placed a folder on the hood of my car and asked whether my wife and daughter were home. The question was meant to remind me that he knew our address. I told Caleb the money was in the car, but I needed to hear exactly what the payment would buy. He leaned closer and said, "It buys your family another month without an accident." Caleb didn't know detectives were listening. He also didn't know the folder he had brought would connect him to threats he had spent 6 months denying. What I didn't know was whether the officers could reach me before Caleb realized there was no money in my car. His right hand stayed inside his jacket, and he kept looking toward the entrance of the empty repair yard. For the first time since this began, Caleb was close enough to hurt the person who had finally said no to him. That person was me. My name is Aaron. I'm 34, married to my wife Leah, and we have an 8-year-old daughter named Mia. Caleb is my first cousin on my father's side. He is 31. When we were children, Caleb wasn't the monster my family now describes. He was impulsive, competitive, and quick to anger, but he could also be funny. He taught me how to ride a dirt bike and once took the blame when we broke our grandfather's workshop window. The adults excused almost everything he did. Caleb's father left when he was 6, and my grandmother Helen believed discipline would make him feel rejected. If he stole from another child, Grandma replaced the item. If he damaged something, an uncle paid for it. The family called him troubled when we should have taught him that consequences were real. When Caleb was 17, he took Grandma's car without permission and drove it into a drainage ditch. Nobody was seriously hurt. Grandma told the police she had allowed him to borrow it because she was afraid an arrest would ruin his future. The family paid for the repairs and required Caleb to apologize at Sunday dinner. Caleb delivered a convincing apology. He cried, hugged Grandma, and spent 2 weekends repairing her fence. Within a month, everyone treated the incident as proof that compassion had worked. Caleb learned a different lesson. If he became emotional after crossing a line, the family would focus on his pain instead of the damage. Years later, when an employer accused him of taking equipment from a work site, Aunt Susan paid for a lawyer. The charge was dismissed because the company's inventory records were poor. Caleb described that as proof that people always falsely accused him. Nobody mentioned that several missing tools had been found in his garage. As an adult, Caleb moved between construction jobs, apartments, and relationships. He always had an explanation for why something had failed. His supervisor was jealous. His landlord was dishonest. His girlfriend was controlling. Someone else was always responsible. Money was the one subject that followed every disaster. Caleb borrowed $200 and promised to repay it on Friday. Then, Friday became the end of the month. If anyone asked again, he acted insulted that family members were keeping score. My parents, Robert and Carol, stopped lending him money years ago. Grandma Helen did not. She paid his phone bill, covered rent, and bought him used cars after he damaged or sold the previous ones. The situation became dangerous after my grandfather Walter died 18 months ago. Grandpa owned a small cabin near Mount Hood. It wasn't luxurious, but the land had become valuable. Caleb had convinced himself that Grandpa intended to leave the cabin to him because they had gone fishing there when Caleb was a teenager. The will left everything to Grandma Helen. After her death, the remaining estate would be divided equally between her 3 children, my father, Caleb's mother Susan, and our Uncle Mark. No grandchild was promised the cabin. Caleb accused my father of manipulating Grandpa. There was no evidence of that. My father had not prepared the will and wasn't present when it was signed, but Caleb repeated the accusation until it became a fact in his mind. At the first family meeting after the funeral, the estate attorney read the relevant sections aloud. Caleb interrupted 3 times and insisted Grandpa had made a verbal promise during a fishing trip. Grandma gently said Grandpa had talked about letting all the grandchildren use the cabin, not giving ownership to Caleb. Caleb stood so quickly that his chair fell backward. He pointed at my father and said, "You think you won because he died before I could make him fix this." My father told Caleb to leave. Aunt Susan followed him outside and returned 20 minutes later saying he was grieving. The rest of us accepted that explanation because we were grieving too. We did not know Caleb had already contacted a real estate agent to ask what the land might be worth. The agent later told investigators that Caleb had represented himself as the future owner. He believed the cabin could be sold for nearly $400,000. From that point on, every family conversation about Grandma's care became, in Caleb's mind, a conspiracy keeping him from that money. At first, his demands sounded almost reasonable. Caleb said he needed $1,500 for overdue rent while he challenged the will. Aunt Susan gave it to him. A month later, he asked Grandma for $3,000 to repair his truck. Grandma paid the mechanic directly, which angered him because he wanted cash. Then he came to my parents' house and demanded $10,000 as an advance on what he called his inheritance. Dad refused. Caleb punched the side of Dad's truck hard enough to dent it and said the family would be sorry for treating him like a stranger. My father told him to leave but did not call the police. That decision taught Caleb that a threat could move the conversation forward without creating consequences. 2 weeks later, the passenger window of Dad's truck was smashed overnight. Nothing was stolen. A folded note on the driver's seat said, "Next time, it won't be glass." My parents suspected Caleb, but the camera above their garage had stopped working. Caleb denied being anywhere near the house. Aunt Susan begged everyone not to accuse him without proof. Dad replaced the window and installed new cameras. The family tried to move on. Caleb did not. He began sending messages from unfamiliar numbers. Some asked for money. Others referred to details that made them frightening. He mentioned the time my father left for work, the grocery store Grandma visited on Thursdays, and the park where Leah took Mia after school. The first message sent directly to me said, "Tell Robert 25,000 ends this. If he keeps hiding behind you, everyone becomes part of it." I called Caleb and told him never to mention my wife or daughter again. Caleb laughed and claimed I was overreacting to a negotiation. He said nobody was threatening anyone. He was only reminding us that actions had consequences. I saved the message and contacted the police. An officer took a report, advised us to preserve every communication, and told us to call immediately if Caleb appeared at any home or school. Because the message was vague and came from a number not registered to Caleb, there was not yet enough to arrest him. That did not mean the police ignored us. A detective contacted the family, reviewed the damaged truck report, and helped my parents request a temporary protection order. But Caleb avoided direct contact after he learned about the order. The rest of the family reacted badly in different ways. Dad became furious and wanted to confront Caleb. Mom checked the cameras constantly and stopped sleeping. Grandma insisted Caleb was only trying to scare us and would never actually hurt anyone. Aunt Susan said she could calm him if everyone gave her time. Uncle Mark suggested paying a smaller amount to make Caleb disappear. He argued that no amount of money was worth risking Mia's safety. I understood the fear behind that suggestion. I also knew there would never be a final payment. Caleb had borrowed or demanded money for years. Every payment taught him which threat worked. We agreed as a family not to give him anything. 3 days later, Grandma secretly transferred him $5,000. Caleb sent her a loving message and promised it was over. Then, less than 2 weeks later, he demanded $25,000 from my father again. This time, he attached a photograph of Mia leaving her dance class. The picture had been taken from across the parking lot. Mia's face was visible, as was the license plate of Leah's car. The message said, "I know what matters to you now." Leah found me standing in our kitchen with the phone in my hand. I could not speak. I had spent weeks telling her that cameras, locked doors, and police reports would keep us safe. The photograph made every reassurance feel empty. We took Mia out of school for several days and stayed with friends whose address Caleb did not know. The police increased their attention to the case and advised the school and dance studio not to release information about Mia. Leah and I told our employers enough to explain why our schedules changed. We varied routines, canceled Mia's birthday party, and stopped posting photographs online. Every normal decision became a security question. Leah checked beneath her car before driving. I woke at small noises and walked through our friend's house holding a baseball bat. The worst night came when someone knocked at the door shortly after midnight. We moved Mia into an interior room while our friend called the police. The visitor turned out to be a delivery driver at the wrong address. Mia heard enough to understand that all 4 adults had been afraid. The next morning, she drew a picture of our house surrounded by cameras. She told Leah the cameras would keep cousin Caleb outside. That was when Leah said we could not live indefinitely as though our child were inside a fortress. Mia knew there was a family problem, but we did not show her the photograph. Leah told her that cousin Caleb was behaving unsafely and that adults were handling it. Mia asked whether he was angry because she had done something wrong. That question destroyed me. Caleb's threats were already changing how my daughter understood safety and blame. The photograph also changed Aunt Susan. She came to my parents' house the next morning, carrying a grocery bag filled with envelopes, bank receipts, and an old phone. Susan admitted Caleb had been threatening her for almost a year. He had demanded money after learning she planned to sell her house and move into a smaller place. When she refused, he threatened to destroy her car, contact her employer, and tell Grandma that Susan had caused his financial problems. Some threats made little sense, but Susan had been too ashamed to tell us. She had paid him $11,800 in 9 months. The old phone contained voice messages Caleb assumed she had deleted. In one, he told Susan that if she warned the family, he would start collecting from the children. In another, he said the cabin belonged to him, and anyone standing between him and the property was choosing what happened next. Those recordings gave investigators something direct. They also revealed the real pattern. Caleb was not reacting to a single argument about Grandpa's will. He had built a system in which fear produced money, and the family's secrecy allowed each victim to believe they were the only one. When we combined the records, we calculated that Caleb had received more than $32,000 from relatives in 18 months. That total did not include rent, repairs, or bills paid directly on his behalf. Each person had believed they were preventing the next crisis. Together, we had financed the escalation. Grandma initially refused to turn over her messages. She said exposing Caleb's words would send him to prison and make reconciliation impossible. Dad finally showed her the photograph of Mia. Grandma sat at the kitchen table for nearly an hour before unlocking her phone. Her messages contained something none of us knew. After sending the $5,000, Grandma had asked Caleb to promise he would leave the family alone. Caleb answered that $5,000 had bought her the privilege of being asked politely. He added that my father would pay the rest once someone he loved became frightened enough. Grandma began crying and told the detective she had thought giving Caleb money was protecting us. The detective did not criticize her. He explained that extortion depended on victims feeling both fear and responsibility. That conversation helped Grandma cooperate, but it did not erase her guilt. The detective assigned to the case brought in an investigator experienced with extortion. We turned over the messages, bank records, camera footage, photographs, and Susan's old phone. The investigator instructed us not to arrange private meetings or send threats back. From that point forward, every contact with Caleb was coordinated through law enforcement. I need to be clear about that because people later accused me of creating a reckless plan by myself. I did not buy recording equipment, follow Caleb, or invent a trap from something I saw in a movie. The police and prosecutors determined what evidence they needed and how contact could occur as safely as possible. Even so, they could not remove the risk. Caleb knew the family had gone to the police. He claimed the voice messages were emotional arguments with his mother and that the photograph of Mia could have come from social media. His attorney contacted the detective before charges were filed and insisted Caleb was the victim of an inheritance dispute. Then Caleb called Grandma from a new number. He told her he would accept one final payment of $25,000 and a signed agreement recognizing his right to the cabin. If the family refused, he said people would begin losing more than property. Grandma kept him on the phone while my father contacted the detective. Under direction, she told Caleb she was too frightened to meet him and that I controlled the money. Caleb called me the next day. I wanted to reject him immediately, but investigators had asked whether I would participate in a controlled conversation. I agreed. During the call, I said the family needed assurance that payment would end the threats. Caleb avoided explicit language. He said I already understood the arrangement and should stop forcing him to explain obvious things over the phone. He was cautious enough to be dangerous. Over several calls, Caleb demanded that I meet him with cash and documents related to the cabin. Investigators believed a controlled meeting could connect him directly to the demand and give them the clearest opportunity to arrest him away from our homes. Leah hated the idea. She asked why a trained officer could not pretend to be me. The detective explained that Caleb knew my face and voice and had refused to deal with anyone outside the family. Leah said that was not a good enough reason to make me a target. I agreed with her. I was terrified. I also knew Caleb was already targeting us. Avoiding the meeting would not make him forget our address or Mia's schedule. The final choice was mine. The investigators said they would not force or shame me if I refused. After discussing the plan with Leah and an attorney, I agreed to participate. For the next week, I barely slept. I wrote down passwords and insurance information for Leah, even though she begged me not to behave as though I expected to die. I told Mia I had to help the police with a family problem and would be home for breakfast. The night before the meeting, my father came to our friend's house and told me he should take my place. Caleb's anger had originally focused on him, and Dad believed I was carrying a risk that belonged to him. The investigators had already rejected that change because Caleb was demanding to meet me, but Dad continued arguing until Leah asked him to stop making the choice harder. Later, Dad apologized for every time he had called Caleb's behavior a family matter. He said the smashed window should have been the moment he involved police and warned everyone. I told him I had made the same mistake after the first message because part of me still thought I could intimidate Caleb into backing down. That was the power Caleb had over us. He knew each person wanted to believe one firm conversation, one payment, or one apology could restore the cousin we remembered. Accepting that he was dangerous felt like betraying our own childhood. Mia hugged me and asked me not to be brave if being brave was dangerous. I almost canceled after that. The meeting was scheduled at a closed automotive repair yard that investigators could monitor. The police handled the location, communications, and safety plan. I was told not to argue, approach Caleb suddenly, or try to restrain him. My only job was to keep the conversation focused on what he wanted and why. Caleb arrived late in a car I did not recognize. He circled once before parking near my car. The repair yard looked abandoned, but officers were positioned out of sight. Knowing they were there did very little to slow my heartbeat. Caleb stepped out carrying a folder. He smiled when he saw I was alone and asked whether Leah and Mia were home. I said they were safe. Caleb answered, "Safe is temporary, that's why we're here." He placed the folder on my hood. Inside was a document claiming Grandma agreed to transfer the cabin to him. Her name was typed at the bottom, but there was no signature. There were also printed maps showing my parents' street and Grandma's route to the grocery store. The maps matched images attached to earlier threats. Caleb had brought the connection with him. I asked what would happen if Grandma refused to sign. Caleb said she would sign after I explained the alternative. I asked him to state the alternative. Caleb stared at me and asked why I was suddenly having difficulty understanding English. Then he leaned toward the driver's window and tried to look inside my car. There was no money inside. Investigators had never intended to place real cash in the vehicle, but Caleb did not know that. His hand moved inside his jacket. I remembered the instructions and did not reach for him or step backward suddenly. I said the family needed to know the payment would end everything. Caleb answered, "It buys your family another month without an accident. After that, they do what I say about the cabin." I told him that wasn't the agreement. Caleb's expression changed. He asked whether I was recording him. Before I could answer, Caleb pulled a handgun partly out of his jacket. He did not point it directly at me, but he made sure I saw it. Caleb said, "Open the car." The officers moved in immediately. I dropped behind the front of the car as they had instructed. Caleb shouted and tried to run toward the far fence. He was arrested before reaching it. No shots were fired and nobody was injured. When an officer told me it was over, I vomited beside the tire. The search after Caleb's arrest found the folder, the weapon, multiple phones, and copies of family schedules. Investigators also found photographs of my parents' vehicles and messages documenting payments from Aunt Susan and Grandma. Some evidence was less dramatic than rumors later suggested, but together it showed planning, surveillance, and repeated demands. The main surprise was that Caleb had kept detailed notes of what each relative had paid. He treated the family like accounts. Next to Grandma's name, he had written, "soft." Next to Susan's, he had written, "ashamed." Next to my father's, he had written, "pressure through kid." That kid was Mia. Seeing those words ended Grandma's belief that Caleb was only lashing out. She had spent months saying he would never hurt us. Now she understood that he had deliberately studied which fear belonged to each person. Caleb remained in custody while the case moved forward. He initially claimed the gun was for self-defense, and the money was a voluntary family settlement. The recordings, messages, payment history, and his statements during the meeting contradicted that story. 10 months later, Caleb pleaded guilty to charges related to extortion, stalking, and possessing the weapon during the offense. The agreement avoided a trial that would have required several family members to testify. He received a multi-year prison sentence and a long-term no-contact order. Before accepting the plea, the judge allowed several of us to submit statements. Leah wrote about Mia asking whether an adult's threats were her fault. Susan described hiding payments from the family. Grandma wrote only 4 sentences. She said loving Caleb had made her excuse him, but protecting him from consequences had not protected the person he became. Caleb spoke at the hearing and apologized to Grandma. He said financial pressure and grief had distorted his thinking. He did not apologize to Leah, Mia, or me. When the judge asked whether he understood that the payments had been obtained through fear, Caleb said he understood that his words had been interpreted that way. That careful non-apology ended any fantasy that prison itself had changed him. Maybe treatment and time eventually will. Our safety cannot depend on that possibility. Not everyone was satisfied. My father wanted the maximum possible sentence. Grandma cried at the hearing and asked whether treatment could replace prison. Aunt Susan blamed herself for making the threats profitable by paying him secretly. I blamed myself for agreeing to a meeting that could have left Leah widowed and Mia without a father. The detective reminded me that Caleb, not I, had brought the weapon. Leah understood that intellectually, but trust did not return the moment he was arrested. We attended counseling because she needed space to say that my decision had frightened her without me defending it as necessary. For several months, I had panic attacks whenever I entered a large parking lot. I would notice a man sitting in a car or hear a door close behind me and feel as though I were back beside the empty repair yard. I took leave from work, then felt guilty because Caleb was still disrupting our finances even from jail. Counseling helped me stop treating fear as proof that I had made the wrong choice. A decision can be justified and still leave damage. Leah did not need me to insist the plan had worked. She needed me to acknowledge what it had cost both of us. Our family also stopped hiding uncomfortable facts in the name of protecting one another. Grandma gave control of her finances to a neutral fiduciary. Susan entered counseling and shared every remaining message. My parents kept the cameras and protection orders active even after Caleb went to prison. Mia is back in school and dance class. She knows Caleb is in prison because he threatened people and demanded money that did not belong to him. We did not tell her every detail. She no longer asks whether his anger was her fault. The cabin is still Grandma's. She considered selling it because it had become a symbol of the entire nightmare. Instead, she rents it through a local manager and uses the income for her care. Caleb never had a legal right to it. I do not feel heroic when I think about the repair yard. I remember his hand inside his jacket, the empty car, and Mia asking me not to be brave if bravery was dangerous. There were trained officers nearby, but for several seconds, none of that guaranteed I would go home. The setup gave prosecutors the clearest evidence and allowed police to arrest Caleb away from our houses. It also required me to step into a threat that had already swallowed my family's lives. So, was I right to agree to that controlled meeting after my cousin threatened my wife, daughter, parents, and grandmother? Or did I risk too much trying to make sure he could never threaten us for money again?